All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to call Senate State Affairs to order. Today is Tuesday, February 9, 2021. Let the record reflect the time is 3:33 p.m. Today we have President and Vice Chair Senator Reinbold, Senator Costello, Senator Holland, Senator Kawasaki is joining us online, and myself, Senator Shell. I'd like to recommend everybody please turn off your cell phones. And we got Terrence Shanagan from my office, Committee A for State Affairs, Carrie Cooper Ryder as ever helping us with Senate Records, and Nate Williams behind us with the LAOs. With that, welcome, and we've got three items on today's agenda. First one we're going to hear is SB 53, Permanent Fund Advisory Vote by Governor Dunleavy. We'll get to that. Second, SJR 6, Constitutional and Permanent Fund and PFDs by Governor Dunleavy. SJR 1 will be third, the Constitutional Amendment Guaranteed Permanent Fund. So we're going to work through those in order. It'll probably be most likely a shorter meeting today based on initial views of these without too many questions is what I would expect. Before we get started, first of all, before we even go there, just to make sure, Senator Kawasaki, can you hear us okay?
Yep.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep. Thanks.
Any committee questions from anybody on any other topics or this before we get started? Okay. Seeing none, first on the agenda today is SB 53 and SJR 6. To present these, representing the administration, we're going to have Mike Barnhill from the Department of Revenue, and we've got Bill Milks from the Department of Law. And are they not here today, so I assume we've got them online, which we do. Should have checked that. And when you guys are ready, go ahead and put yourself on the record, and I'll let you guys talk us through it. Like we did last week, so I'm ahead of the curve this time. If there are questions as we go to avoid having to circle back, just go ahead and let me know, including Scott online, just jump in, and we'll answer them as we go to keep the discussion moving. So with that, gentlemen, please begin.
So for the record, Mr. Chair, my name is Mike Barnhill, Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Revenue. Pleased to be here on behalf of the administration to present SJR 6 and SB 53. With me is Mr. Bill Milks from the Department of Law and Ms. Caroline Schultz from the Office of Management and Budget. And between the three of us, hopefully we can present these two vehicles and answer any questions the committee has. Mr. Chair, at the risk of disrupting your agenda, I think it might make more sense for the committee if we start with SJR 6. SJR 6 and SB 53 are intended to be complementary vehicles. SJR 6 sets out the structure. SB 53 implements the details of the structure. But before I proceed, I just want to see if you're wedded to doing SB 53 first.
Continue as you gentlemen think best. We'll just ask questions as we go. It doesn't matter to me at all. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, Mr. Chair, SJR 6 is the Dunleavy administration's proposal to convert the Alaska Permanent Fund in the Constitution from its existing structure to an endowment structure. And since this is the first time that the administration has made a proposal to convert the permanent fund to an endowment structure, I thought I'd take the committee through at a conceptual level what that means. The legislature's had numerous endowment structure proposals submitted over the last 10 years, but this is the first time this administration has proposed this. So at a conceptual level, an endowment is a fund structure where the goal is to invest the assets of the endowment and spend from the endowment in such a way that it's sustainable forever. And so that the assets can fund the objectives of the endowment both today and in the future. And the endowment is a unique fund structure. It has one account. An endowment diversifies its investments. It has a long-term investment horizon. And the purpose of that is to take advantage of long-term capital appreciation through its investing program. An endowment has a distribution or a spending rule that balances spending with preserving the inflation-adjusted value of the deposited funds. And finally, an endowment preserves intergenerational equity. And by intergenerational equity, I mean that the beneficiaries of the endowment have the same access to the assets and the income that's generated out of the endowment today as they'll have 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. It's designed to be permanent of indefinite duration. I'll pause and just see if there are any questions on the elements of endowment, and then I'll go on to a little bit of history.
Any questions? We'll start with Senator Costello.
Thank you. So in statute, we have an endowment approach to the permanent fund. Does this just take what's in statute and elevates it to the Constitution with the support of the people?
Yeah, through the chair, Senator Costello, it's a good question. And so, and what I'm going to get to in a bit with the history of the permanent fund is we have adopted by statute various elements of an endowment, but we're not all the way there. And the one element that's missing is that first one that I mentioned, the one account structure. Currently, we have a two account structure. And so in the Constitution, we'll be converting that two account structure to a one account structure. And there's a reason why that's important. Okay, Mr. Chair, I'll just go ahead and proceed.
So hold on, Mike. I just want to make sure Senator Costello had a follow-up, or is that good? Okay, we had another question from Senator Reinbold.
So I have two questions. First of all, why are you changing this to an endowment? Because it's worked so well for so many years. And the second question I have is, how is this going to change the permanent fund dividend?
So through the chair, Senator Reinbold, it's a great question. And there's a little bit of history that goes into answering that question. Essentially, this is a modernization of the permanent fund account structure. What we have in place is a two-account structure that is based on, but not necessarily completely governed by, trust law, which goes back quite a long ways. Let me just dive into that a bit. So, in trust, historically, and we're talking, going back hundreds of years, a trust would have a two-account structure, principal account and an income account. And a traditional trust spending rule was fairly rigid, that you save the principal and spend the income. And by income, I mean the cash generated by the principals, dividends, fixed income coupons, and real estate rents. That's cash. And in a traditional trust, the realized capital gains, so if you sell a stock, you buy a stock for 5 and sell it for 10, all of the realized capital gains historically in a trust account were retained in principal. The problem with the legacy trust approach was one of efficiency. And let me describe what that means. Because you could only spend cash in the form of cash coupons, cash dividends, cash real estate rents, trust investment managers tended to tilt the asset allocation to investments that generated cash and away from investments that grew from a capital appreciation perspective over time. That meant that the trust fund would not grow as fast as an endowment might grow if it's more heavily exposed to capital gains, capital growth through equity investments. So beginning in the late 1950s, academics started raising concerns that the traditional form of trust investment was inefficient and that trust funds should start diversifying their assets so that they could grow and take advantage of the stock market, take advantage of capital appreciation, basically take advantage of American capitalism. And the solution was to develop the endowment structure. And so that solution essentially began to spread throughout the country and the world beginning in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. But what's happened is it's taken some time for the legal and accounting rules governing funds to catch up with investment practices. In terms of the history of the permanent fund, it's essentially been a steady path from 1976, picking up various elements of endowments. So in 1976, when the permanent fund was created in the Constitution, it was essentially created with this traditional principal and income account structure. And in fact, in the first statute governing the permanent fund, all realized capital gains were retained in principal. The problem, of course, there is that meant there wasn't going to be much income flowing to the income account, which was later renamed the earnings reserve account, and there would be the bias towards having fixed income instruments as opposed to equity instruments, and the fund would grow less slowly. The legislature in the early 1980s made its first step towards embracing an endowment structure with the first statutory change, which was to allow capital gains, realized capital gains, to flow to the earnings reserve account, and inflation proofing being appropriated back. And then along with that, the legislature started permitting the permanent fund to invest in an increasing array of investments, including stocks and real estate. But ultimately, in 2005, the legislature said, we're not going to tell you what you can or can't invest in anymore. We're going to replace this list of permissible investments with the prudent investment rule, and you can invest in anything so long as it's prudent from a portfolio-wide basis. And then finally, in 2018, the last step that the legislature took towards the endowment structure was to adopt a distribution rule in SB 26. And the first distribution rule is 5.25% of the lagging 5-year market value of the permanent fund, which scaled down to the 5% distribution of the lagging 5-year market value, which is what we have today. There's one remaining step, and that is to adopt the one account structure, and SJR 6 does that in the Constitution. The benefit here is when you go to a one account structure, we don't have the issue of whether we exhaust the earnings reserve account, and that's been an issue before the state since 2018 because we're spending more out of the permanent. We're spending 5% out of the permanent fund each year, and there could come a time when a combination of spending and declines in market returns that we run the earnings reserve down to zero, and that's the difficulty with the two account structure. The one account structure will solve that. That was a long, somewhat rambling answer to your question, Senator Reinbold. And you also asked what the change would be to the permanent fund dividend. And I'll get to that now, but let me pause and see if there's any more questions regarding the endowment structure.
Yeah, I think you lost lots of us because that was an extremely long answer. But whenever someone uses modernization, that definitely perks my ears up. And in regards to how this has worked, and it's worked so well in the past, and the fund has made, the principal has been making considerable money. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to just squeeze the earnings reserve account and the principal account together. So just really in a sentence or two, could you just describe why you're changing the legacy to a modernization in a layman's terms?
So through the chair, Senator Reinbold, it's basically to eliminate the two account structure. With the two account structure, there is always going to be a risk that we exhaust the balance of the earnings reserve. And if we exhaust the balance of the earnings reserve, it means no money for permanent fund dividends, and it means no money for government spending. That's the risk. That's the risk that we're trying to address, so that never happens.
One more follow-up Senator Reinbold's got here.
Okay, so I guess that definitely causes me some pause because the principle was so we could never touch it, and now you're able to touch all of it because I'm assuming you're going to want a percent of market value from the total earning reserve and the principal now. Is that correct?
through the chair, Senator Reinbold. So all endowments, one feature is that they only spend a certain percentage of the market value each year. And the distribution rule is essentially designed to protect the inflation-adjusted value over time, so that the value of the endowment basically remains the same from an inflation perspective at all points in time, maintains that intergenerational equity, maintains what we think of as the principal or the corpus for all time.
Okay, Mr. Barner, I'm going to ask this a little differently because I know what Senator Ramble's driving at, and I think the answer was kind of yes from what she asked and what you're answering, but I think there is a bit of confusion, and I want to try to clarify it. With the two account structure that you have mentioned, we have the principal, we have the ERA. The principal would take a super vote of the legislature to access it, to do something with the funds, kind of a safety valve. In the ERA, we have a different thing, a simple majority vote. When you get to the CBR, it's different, back to the vote requirement. So to make it a little bit simpler, if you go to a one account structure, a question that would be asked, and I think would help clarify some of this, is that, in again, layman's terms, if it goes under this constitutional amendment that you are proposing to a one account structure, how is that money accessed? In other words, I think most people that have listened at least understand on the POMV model that you get 5%, say, and that's what you get, and you shouldn't access anything else out. But what does it take, and what are you changing, if anything, to access it beyond the 5%? Does that make sense to try to clarify this?
Sure. So SB 53 implements the structure of SJR 6, and there's two pieces that the legislature would provide by statute. One is the distribution rule. So the legislature would, by statute, identify what percentage of the total market value could be appropriated in any one year. And in SB 53, that percentage is 5% of the lagging 5-year market average. The other piece of SB 53 governs how that distribution, that POMV amount, we sometimes call it, is allocated between the permanent fund dividend and government spending. And SB 53 proposes that be a 50-50 allocation. In terms of accessing the principal under the current Constitution, Mr. Chair, no amount of principal can be appropriated by the legislature, not by a supermajority vote, not by any vote. That principal is protected. Under SJR 6, no amount in excess of the legislative spending rule, let's say it's 5%, can be accessed by the legislature for any purpose.
That was the point, Mike. Thank you. I think that's where you're getting some confusion. Thanks for the answer, because it helps clarify that. I was trying to ask it in a way that would get us to that more base level answer, because I think people think that can happen. And I'm going to defer. I've had her on hold here for a minute. Senator Costello has a question.
Thank you. So right now we have a hands-off policy towards the principal of the fund. And if we go to a one-account system, it becomes the legislature following its own laws, which we haven't really had the best track record. And so what protection is there of the permanent fund to make sure that Alaskans know that the legislature can't be accessing the fund and depleting it?
So under SJR 6, through the chair, SB 53, the basic protection is the legislature's setting of that distribution rule. And the legislature's setting of that distribution rule should be guided by advice from the Alaska Permanent Fund as to how much they project they will be able to earn in the investment markets on a real return basis over, the next 10 to 20 years. And by real return, if I could, Mr. Chair, just define that. Real return is the return that you get from the investment markets minus the inflation that you've experienced. So if you get a return, we call it a nominal return of 8%, and inflation in a particular time period is 3%, the real return is going to be 5%. Over long periods of time, the legislature should not spend out of an endowment any more than the real return. And it does make a difference whether your horizon for examining this is 1 year, 5 year, 10 years, 20 years. The basic point is what we're trying to do is protect the corpus of the fund over long periods of time so that we preserve that inflation-adjusted value. But in this set of legislative vehicles, it's up to the legislature to set that distribution rule, and this is giving the legislature the flexibility and the discretion to change that distribution over time. But the way in which it does that is important. It should do it in a way that preserves that inflation-adjusted value of the permanent fund so that the permanent fund is sustainable and it's permanent. And there's a wide array of resources available to the legislature to guide it in its enactment of that distribution percentage, including the permanent fund, including the Department of Revenue.
Senator Costello, good.
Good's not necessarily what I was thinking, but
Your
yes,
question
I
was
don't have any
answered.
other questions.
I think, Mr. Barnhill, one of the things, if I was to surmise that really quickly, is that Senator Costello's point is valid in that when it becomes statutory, and I think just a quicker, closer to a yes or no answer, is that with SB 53 and the legislature's demonstrated past that it doesn't always follow the statutory laws if it deems in the future it wants to change them, there is no guarantee that we would not change that moving forward. And I understand the principles of we shouldn't and we should follow this and et cetera, but the reality is if it's statutory, not constitutional, we could spend more, we could change the formula, do things at our will. Is that, and that's kind of what the question was, at least in part. And can you do that in more of a yes or no fashion?
Mr. Chair, you've gotten to my weakness. And this absolutely gives the legislature flexibility to change that distribution rule. And I don't want to say that's a weakness. Actually, I think it's a strength. And at the risk of differing with the chair, I think the legislature has demonstrated without exception that it has appropriated from the permanent fund pursuant to statute consistently since it was created. And so right now we have the 5% spending rule, and the legislature has abided by the spending rule of SB 26 in every year. And prior to that, it abided by the permanent fund dividend rule in every year. I think these are important issues. I think the legislature takes the permanence of the permanent fund seriously. But in answer, can the legislature set a distribution rule higher than 5%? Yes, it can. But in order to maintain the permanence of the permanent fund, distributions really have to be consistent with the real return of the fund over time. And so if it sets a distribution rule too high, and over time the spending exceeds the real return of the fund, the legislature would be wise to reconsider that and change the rule.
I have indeed found your weakness. Your kryptonite is short answers, so that is kind of funny. But I will ask this in addition to having that discussion, and it's fine. I don't want to get into the politics of what people believe, and that's this is just obviously certain legislators have concern of whether or not the promises made today will be kept tomorrow, and that's fine. That's a discussion we should have and will always have, I'm sure. One of the 2 years ago, I'm sure you will remember, we went through this before, kind of deja vu, the governor's bills, and we had a lot of hearings and public testimony. One of the things that came out that was also rather confusing, and a lot of questions were generated and sent to us about it. Could you briefly, that's going to become an inside joke with you and I, talk about what you just did with the percentage of draw and the long-term history of the fund and its performance. And one of the questions and confusions came out that if you are taking 5%, that we are drawing the fund down. That's not the case, because you have to account for, let's say we had 8% returns. So obviously that becomes a factor for us when we are trying to make sure we are not overspending based on inflation proofing, inflation itself, etc., and the growth of the fund. But that one of the issues are you have to account every year you are getting earnings, which offsets what you take with the POMV draw. So there is a difference between those. It's the balance that we're trying to achieve. And that, Mike, might generate a very long question for you. So I'm hoping you can baseline that a little shorter from the conversation 2 years ago to today, so that people can hear again the fact that we get earnings every year. We're going to draw a certain amount. We're trying to achieve the balance. However, I would also like an answer to why we chose 5%, because my understanding from a lot of other economists is that 4.5% is considered to be a more reasonable long-term draw on the performance of the fund as opposed to 5%, and why you chose that.
Through the chair, one-word answer: balance. That's what we're striving for. And I think you can achieve balance by looking at the performance of the returns over the recent longer past, 1, 5, 10 years. What's the real return then? And then look forward. What do we expect the real return will be? What's the number then, based on the, our backward look and a forward look? What's the number that balances? For long periods of time, 5% is thought to be a fair balance. But we're in an environment now where many consultants think looking forward, 5% is going to be very hard to achieve. And various funds are looking at how they change that. Do they do it now? Do they wait? And I think you wanted a short answer, but I think there's a lot of information that the legislature and the permanent fund, the Department of Revenue can bring to the table to help inform the legislature in achieving that right balance.
Probably more of a political answer for you, but is the administration open to reducing that number if it's ultimately determined by the legislature that a lower number, say 4.75 or 4.5, was more prudent?
Mr. Chair, I can't comment on the administration's position on that issue because I don't know it. But what I would say is there's a lot of information that I think needs to be considered in order to strike the right balance. And I think it would be appropriate for the legislature to schedule hearings so all that information could be put on the table.
Okay, thank you. Other questions at this time? Because they tie together, unless you have something else or Mr. Milks wants to add to SJR 6, would you like to move into SB 53?
Mr. Chair, if I could just finish up a bit on distribution rules. There's a variety of spending rules or distribution rules. All of our conversation so far has talked about what we call a static rule. That's a fixed rule that doesn't change, like 5%. And again, the point of that is to ensure that over various periods of time, we're only distributing the real return of the fund. There are also dynamic rules that float based on inflation and market returns, and they're a little more complicated to enact and follow. I won't go into the details on how exactly dynamic rules work, but the point is to smooth the volatility in distributions. There are a number of large universities, endowments that use dynamic distribution rules, and the trustees of the permanent fund recently issued a trustee paper. It's trustee paper number 9, and there's a fairly exhaustive discussion about different distribution rules that are used in endowment world. And finally, Mr. Chair, I wanted to highlight 2 years ago in the public school trust context, 3 years ago, HB 213, we converted the public school trust from a traditional principal and income trust to accounts to an endowment with a statutory spending rule of no more than 5% of the average market value of the trust. And that's kind of like a hybrid static / dynamic distribution rule. Following the conversion to an endowment, the Department of Revenue redeployed the trust assets to more fully take advantage of long-term capital appreciation. And so far, Mr. Chair, it's working well. We have a statutory distribution rule that allows us to recommend to the legislature to spend up to 5% of the market value. We could recommend a lower number, and that seems to be working. And that's a way for the Department of Revenue to present information to the legislature that would guide that distribution.
Okay.
And I'll pause before I go on to SB 53, see if there's any more questions about structure.
Any questions from the committee? Senator Holland?
No, I'm good.
Oh, thought that was a yes. Okay. Did you have anything from Mr. Milks? Was he going to add in, or is he just going to jump in if there's questions for him specifically?
Mr. Mills is ready to either answer questions or discuss the sectional analyses for these vehicles. And we can proceed to that right now. SB 53, as I indicated, proposes a static 5% distribution rule and a 50-50 allocation of the distribution between PFD and government expenses.
Okay, since we're on SJR 6, let's go ahead and finish it up just to do it the right way on a protocol. So if you want to run through the sectionals with him, let's knock it out, and then we'll circle back to 53.
Okay, thank you, Chairman Shower. This is Bill Milks from the Department of Law. So SJR 6, Mr. Barnhill has explained essentially what the proposal is to move to the endowment model for the permanent fund. The sectional sets forth the changes to the existing permanent fund amendment. The permanent fund amendment is in Article 9, Section 15. It was adopted by the voters in 1976. The changes are in Section 1. There's a change which is providing that the permanent fund income shall be retained in the permanent fund, except as provided in Section 2. And that change in the permanent fund amendment reflects what Mr. Barnhill has described, which is that this proposed amendment moves to the endowment model. So the current permanent fund amendment language reads that the principal can only be used for investments. The income will be deposited in the general fund or another fund as provided by law. The earnings reserve account is that other fund. So that income is available for appropriation under this amendment. As the permanent fund earns income, it will stay within the permanent fund. Section 2 sets out has 3 new subsections for permanent fund amendment that set out the process described earlier, which is first, subsection B is setting out your the spending out of the permanent fund will be by a percentage of the average market value of the fund for the first 5 of the preceding six fiscal years. And that percentage is set by law, which means set by the legislature. Subsection C then provides for the first time in the permanent fund in the Constitution, it provides for a dividend to the residents, and it provides that a portion of that money that's withdrawn each year from the permanent fund shall be allocated for dividends as provided by law, which means as provided by the legislature. Subsection D sets up a process by which, if there's going to be a change in the law as far as how dividends of how the money from the permanent fund will be allocated for dividends, if there's a change in that allocation for dividends by the legislature, then that also goes to the people for vote for an approval. Section 3 then are several transition provisions to basically make sections 1 and 2 work. For example, your Section 3 on A, you're providing for the earnings reserve account balance to be deposited into the permanent fund and become part of the principal. If this proposed amendment is approved, then it's setting up the time period in which appropriations will begin to be followed under the constitutional amendment. And then C and D discuss the process by which the law can be changed, both either in regard to the amount, the percentage of market value amount that can leave the permanent fund, as well as the process regarding the change in law regarding dividends. And then finally, Section 4 provides that the proposed amendments would be before the voters at the next general election in conformity with Article 13, Section 1, and that would be November 2022. And that's what I have on the section of church showers.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the committee? Okay. Back to Mr. Barnhill. Do you have any further comments you want to make on SJR 6 for the moment?
No.
Okay, at this time we're going to go ahead and set that bill aside for further discussion later, and next up is going to be SB 53.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I've described the mechanics of SB 53, and so I'll hand it off to Mr. Milks to do the sectional.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Shower. Again, it's Bill Milks from the Department of Law to provide the section on SB 53. As it's been explained earlier, SB 53 is a bill that would provide for a new framework for spending from the permanent fund income. And in its most critical piece, what it does is provide that when the money is withdrawn from the permanent fund based on the percentage of market value, which would be 5% as proposed in the bill, then there's a distribution of that money, as 50% would be available for dividends and 50% would be available to the general fund. So basically SB 53 is trying to provide the new framework for spending from the permanent fund. As Mr. Barnhill has described, it is connected in with SJR 6, which is also proposing a constitutional amendment that would follow this pathway. But it's so then that's its proposal. Section 1 makes certain changes in existing language because of the new spending proposal here on the 50-50. Then you'd be deleting language that's in the current statute that talks about the statutory dividend formula, and you'd also be inserting that the amount that would be available for appropriations 5%. Section 2 then amends existing law to set forth what is the amount of money that could be appropriated from the earnings reserve account, which is the 50% may be appropriated to the dividend fund for dividends, 50% may be appropriated to the general fund. Section 3 provides that after those appropriations for dividends into the general fund, there could also be an appropriation from the earnings reserve back to the principal of the fund for the purpose of inflation proofing. I'd say sections 4 and 5 and 6 are basically addressing other statutory language to fit these changes described above regarding the 50-50 section.
Stop there for a second, Mr. Milks.
Uh-huh.
I want to clarify something because, as Mr. Barnhill pointed out, we would go to what I understand would be a one account system versus two. You just mentioned the ERA a few seconds ago. So can you clarify how these would work either separately or conjunction? Because I think that's going to generate confusion if we're talking about ERA transfers, but the previous discussion was talking about getting away from the ERA to one account. So can one of you or whoever needs to clarify that, please?
Yes, Chair, that's a very, very good question. So I'm going to answer give you a technical answer about the statute being proposed, and I think I'll turn it back again to Mr. Barnhill to place this in context on how these things work together. But SB 53 is proposing to set up this 50-50 framework for how to split the permanent fund income, how it will be spent. But it is existing under our current Alaska constitutional law provision on the permanent fund. That existing provision maintains this principal and income, which is the earnings reserve account distinction. So under SB 53, you're trying to set the process up as far as how the allocations would work if there was a constitutional amendment, as SJR 6 is, 50-50. But SB 53 is trying to act now also, and therefore it has to work under the existing law, which is that there is an earnings reserve account. The Alaska Supreme Court has said it's fully available for appropriation. And so SB 53 is proposing a framework to apply right now when you're utilizing the earnings reserve account, but also to be, the pathway forward under SJR 6 as well, as far as setting an amount, the percentage of market value of 5%, and how to split that money. So I know that it is rather complex. Maybe I can, if Mr. Barnhill wants to explain a little bit more about how this is envisioned as a packet to work together.
Bill, I don't think we need to, Mike, unless you want to really add something to that. That's a good enough explanation. What I'm trying to drive at is that the order we're briefing these, and we just talked a whole section, which was a much longer discussion about SGR 6 to a one-account structure, and then we have this bill that's separate, but everybody thinks they go together, and now you're talking one structure, one draw, but now you're talking ERA transfer. So what I wanted on the public record was the explanation from the administration of how this might work if one was to pass and the other one wasn't, or passing in conjunction, because we need to be very clear on that distinction. There is, as you are well aware, a very high lift in a constitutional amendment, but not so high on a statutory one. So this could happen in a number of ways. So I just wanted that on the record. I think that's good enough, unless there are other questions or something from Mike that would clarify. Senator Costello, please.
Thank you. I have, I think, two questions here. So I do understand that the endowment model is intended to sort of organically inflation-proof because you're spending less than you earn. But my question has to do with Section 3 on page 2, where under the system we have now, the inflation proofing must happen, and the language that exists now is the corporation shall transfer, and we would change that to a less secure system, which would be the phrase on line 26 that the legislature may appropriate. So we're going to a shall appropriate, must appropriate, to may appropriate, and I wanted to ask why that language may is in there. And then secondly, so we learned, Mr. Chair, that the legislature would change the percentage draw. However, the question going before the people of Alaska, which I do support any change to the dividend or changes to the permanent fund structure, go to the people of Alaska. The question in this legislation says that the question before Alaskans would be can the legislature appropriate 5% of the market value of the permanent fund? And yet, Mr. Chair, we heard that then the legislature has the ability to change that. If the people of Alaska say 5%, I would want to be held to that, to what they want. So is there any assurance in this package of legislation that the legislature would be held to what the people of Alaska want in terms of the 5% draw?
Mr. Chair, this is Mike Barnhill, Department of Revenue. So just first a comment. There's transition language in SB 53. SJR 6 clearly establishes the one account structure in Section 1 of the resolution. But prior to that, this won't go before the people until the general election in calendar year 22. Prior to that, we do have the existing statute and the existing inflation proofing that we have to satisfy. With respect to, through the chair, with respect to Senator Costello's questions, the people only vote on a change to the allocation of the distribution between government and PFD. And so if that changes, the people get to vote. The people do not get to vote on the distribution percentage that the legislature sets.
Still, you want to follow up on that? Okay, good. Other questions?
This is Bill Nuff's Department of Law, Chair Shower, and just to make sure we capture all the questions through the chair to Senator Costello. You had a question about the vote, but you also started with the question about Section 3 on the inflation proofing. The practice has been that the amount for inflation proofing is appropriated. So that's why this SB 53 uses the word appropriate.
Mr. Chair, my question wasn't about the word appropriate. It was about the word may, which gives the option not to, as opposed to right now the corporation shall transfer. So they do inflation proof. And my question has to do with why does it then say the legislature may appropriate instead of shall appropriate?
Through the chair, thank you, Senator Costello. That's in there because we've had the Alaska Supreme Court weigh in. It was on the dividends, but in the Wilikowski case, but the court has seen pretty clear that in order to move that money, it must be by appropriation. So that shall transfer language is also in the permanent fund dividend section, and the Alaska Supreme Court said that's subject to appropriation. So that's essentially cleaning up, clarifying that language, subject to appropriation. That has been the practice in budget bills. So that's the reason for that, SB 53.
Still follow up? Okay. And I think, and Mr. Barno, you don't have to answer, but I think you can see where some of us have some concerns based on demonstrated history in the past of changing things. And so, like I said, that's not you don't need to answer, and that's not something you should speculate on, but the politics of it, we get a little antsy when we see things that would not appropriately tie our hands to what the intent of things are moving forward. And the assurances, as Senator Costello has asked for, are hard to come by. Okay, please continue with section analysis. I think we were back on section 7. If there's no more questions, please continue.
Yes, thank you, Chair Shower. Section 7 actually is just a clarification again on the Section 7 is addressing just how dividends are calculated. And on that page, all it does is clarify again that the legislature places money in the dividend fund by appropriation rather than the permanent fund corporation transfer. And that was the precise issue in the Wilikowski case. Section 8 is just repealing two statutory provisions that are not necessary once, if this bill, through sections 1 and 2, the new framework for appropriations from the earnings reserve account are established. So it's sort of a clarification or conforming section there. Section 9 is the advisory vote section that I think Senator Costello is making reference to. This bill does provide that there would be an advisory vote by the voters if this bill passes, and that it would be held, if the bill passes this year, it would be held this year, and the voters would be asked basically whether or not they approve of this law that sets a 5% of market value amount of money that can be withdrawn from the permanent fund, and that it would be split based on the 50-50. Sections 10 and 11 are just conforming provisions, again, to deal with it. Section 2 will provide that the percentage of market value draw is 5%. Section 12 is an immediate effective date regarding the advisory vote. And then Section 13 is the standard effective date of July 1.
Okay. Thank you. Questions from the committee? Okay. Mr. Barnhill, Mr. Milks, any further comments or brief on SB 53?
No, sir.
Okay. Seeing no questions or comments from the committee at this time, we're going to go ahead and set this bill aside as well. We'll be bringing those back up later for further discussions. If you have questions, comments from the committee, please forward those to us. We'll get those to the various departments and get answers back as we go through this. Last 2 years ago, it took us about a month to run through all the different variations in state affairs judiciary. I imagine it'll be the same process here. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. And anybody that doesn't need to be here for follow-on is cleared off at this time. And we get back on the script. We're now going to bring up SJR 1. Presenting in person today, we'll have Senator Bill Wielechowski and his staff, Sonia Kawasaki. When you're ready, you know the drill. Please put yourself on the record and begin the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Bill Wielechowski. I am a state senator representing East Anchorage and J-Bear, and joining me is Sonia Kawasaki, my chief of staff. I was also co-counsel in the lawsuit that we brought to try to overturn the governor's veto several years ago on the PFD. I'll just, if I could, Mr. Chair, just touch on a couple of the questions, because I'm glad you brought this bill up and with the governor's bills. There's definitely a contrast in how to do this. I know everybody has different ideas, but I think Senator Costello, you really hit on some of the problems with the governor's bill. We both looked at it, found it that both bills actually be very confusing. I think if they were passed the way they're currently written, they'd very likely be subject to litigation. But the real problem is as was mentioned, they don't actually require that a PFD be paid, which is the fundamental problem that we've had for the last 5 years, because they contain language that continue to say the legislature may appropriate, which is how the Supreme Court interpreted our current laws. Even though our current laws say that a permanent fund dividend shall be transferred, or permanent fund funds shall be transferred and shall be paid, inflation proofing shall be paid out, or shall be transferred from the earnings reserve to the corpus. But the Supreme Court essentially said that really means they may be transferred, it may be paid. So we don't think those bills fix the problems, and we think there's a better way to do it, and hence this resolution that's in front of you. This resolution we think is much more simple, and it really fixes the crux of the problem, we believe. It puts before the people of Alaska a vote asking whether to put the permanent fund dividend in the Alaska Constitution. I've heard some debate over the years, why put the PFD in the Constitution? And this is really the only true way to protect the permanent fund dividend. We've heard for years that we need to restructure the permanent fund in order to protect the dividend, and the legislature did that by statute in 2018, and yet Alaskans' permanent fund dividends continue to shrink every year. Many Alaskans were shocked, of course, when the governor vetoed the dividend back in 2016, and the legislature has since done that, since cut the dividend 4 years in a row. And the Supreme Court has said, even though our statutes are very clear, and the statutes say that the PFD shall be paid according to the statutory formula, the Supreme Court has said, well, you can ignore the plain language of the statutes. So the governor can veto the permanent fund dividend to whatever level he or she chooses. Future legislatures can set the PFD at whatever level they choose in future years. Legislature could set it to 0 if they choose. And we've heard legislators advocate for that. We often hear from organizations, corporations, special interests demanding predictability, stability, consistency in our taxing structures. Don't Alaskans deserve this same stability, this same consistency, this same predictability with regards to their PFDs? From a policy perspective, Mr. Chairman, as we all know, that the PFD has been one of the most successful and popular government programs in American history for both individual Alaskans and for businesses. According to the Institute of Social and Economic Research at the University of Alaska, tens of thousands of Alaskans had been elevated every single year from poverty because of the statutory PFD. Alaska has, in recent years, the lowest, for many years actually, the lowest income inequality in the United States, in large part because of the permanent fund dividend. And according to ICER, the PFD has creates every year thousands of jobs for Alaskans. Many people don't realize that the founders of the permanent fund in 1976 had envisioned the prospect of a dividend to the people of Alaska. One of the arguments I hear is, well, no, the permanent fund was really meant to pay for government. That's not true. I mean, it certainly was contemplated. However, that wasn't the only contemplation. In fact, Governor Hammond spoke of having a dividend flow from the permanent fund, and several historic statements were made about the future of a dividend program, including several that I've put in your hearing packets. In fact, the constitutional amendment in 1976 was specifically amended through the committee process to allow, very specifically, for a dividend to be paid out. There's a letter of intent in 1976 which I've included in your packet, Mr. Chairman, which was put in by the Speaker of the House to actually say this, that we are amending this constitutional amendment so that a dividend can be paid out. It was absolutely contemplated. By 1982, Governor Hammond and the legislature saw that those with political influence were able to take greater advantage of the permanent fund income for their own benefit at the cost of Alaskans, average Alaskans. Giving everyone an equal share of the state's oil wealth to spend how they, not government, saw fit was one of the important rationales for the permanent fund dividend. And it's important to remember that the PFD reflects Alaskans' ownership share in our oil wealth. While the current value of the Alaska Permanent Fund is roughly $74 billion, we need to put this in perspective. Article 9, Section 15 of the Constitution requires that at least 25% of the mineral rights, mineral rentals, royalties, royalty sale proceeds, federal mineral revenue sharing payments, and bonuses received by the state go into the permanent fund. And I want to address what I've heard from some, that the PFD is some sort of entitlement. And we believe it's absolutely not an entitlement. In fact, this issue was addressed, and this was discussed at length during the creation of the dividend program. The subsurface rights, as we all know, in Alaska, belong to the people collectively. Our Constitution is not like any other state in the United States. It's not like California, Texas, North Dakota, where if you find oil on your property, it's yours. If you find oil on your property in Alaska, in most parts of the state, it belongs to the people in common. And we have a constitutional obligation under Article 8, Section 2, to ensure that these resources are utilized for the maximum benefit of the people. The authors of the 1982 PFD legislation very clearly understood this and tied our current PFD to this constitutional obligation. It's in the minutes, Mr. Chairman. They understood every Alaskan has a right to their share of our oil wealth, and the best, most efficient way to do this was through the dividend program. And in the whole scheme of things, Alaskans have gotten a very small share of our oil wealth. And I'll just give you some numbers to reflect this. For decades, 100% of state property taxes have gone to government. 100% of corporate income taxes have gone to the government. 100% of production taxes have gone to the government. And 75% of our royalties have gone to government. And our royalty rate is typically 12.5%. And the people get 25% of that share, which means Alaskans get 3.125% of the value of our oil, which goes into the permanent fund. But they don't actually get that, Mr. Chairman, because historically they've only gotten 50% of the earnings generated from these contributions, and the rest has been available for government. And in recent years, we've seen government take 60, 70% of that. Moreover, the authors of the current PFD law put a letter of intent into the law stating that the people should have, quote, first call on the earnings of the permanent fund. However, in recent years, the people have not had first call. Instead, the people have gotten the scraps of whatever was left over after government took their share. That is a violation of the intent of the law. Under this resolution, the historic formula is honored, but in the alternative, the people in government split the POMV at 50-50, with the people receiving the greater value of those two calculations. In this way, the people receive first call, not last call. The statutory formula remains in place. Government must look to generate revenue in the way any other state does, or make cuts, Mr. Chairman, as any other state does. There is currently no protection at all for the permanent fund dividend, and the only way to protect the PFD is through the Constitution, by putting it in the Constitution. And that is what this resolution does. To be clear, this resolution does not, in and of itself, put the PFD in the Constitution, but rather it allows a vote for the people to decide if the PFD should be protected in the Constitution. Those who oppose this will have a full and fair opportunity to make their argument against this, and I'm sure they'll spend a lot of money doing it. But an issue as critically important as this should be decided in a democratic election. And we should respectfully let the people decide this issue once and for all, Mr. Chairman, and I would respectfully urge you to support this and move it out of committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wielechowski. We'll start with questions, and Senator Costello.
Oh, thank you. And, you know what, Mr. Chair, I appreciate you having both the three bills together in the same committee, because just like I was talking about earlier where it said may appropriate, so the previous legislation put faith and trust in the legislature, whereas this legislation puts the faith and trust in our Constitution. And I think that's a better place to put our faith and trust. The other thing I like about this is that it takes care of the people of Alaska first. It says right here, it shall be transferred for use in the dividend, for the payments of the dividend. After the transfer, then comes government. So in this measure, we've got the people are first and government is second. And I just really appreciate that, and I want to thank the sponsor for bringing this forward today.
Okay, other comments or questions at the moment? So I would make a couple here. We went through this 2 years ago, same thing. Like I said, it continues to be some deja vu as we go through it. Appreciate all the comments. I wanted to add one here because I mentioned them before, heard some of the same arguments. And I think I would imagine most of us are somewhat reticent to open up, crack open the Constitution because it's got its issues when you do so. But I think all of us also recognize that at times that may be the only way you can set the bar high enough that, some things can be protected, which is the reason we have it, whether it's the Bill of Rights with certain inalienable rights like freedom of speech. So I've heard legislators here say things like that, like, I don't want to equate the PFD with freedom of speech. Well, at the same time, we want to ensure that it's there for future generations, and if we're not careful, it won't be, which is certainly one of our concerns. And I heard several years ago when I first got here that legislators were saying things like, well, that's never what Governor Hammond intended. Writings and speeches and TV, appearances to the contrary. And I had a chance one night to sit down with his chief of staff of many, many years. And it was a fascinating conversation, probably lasted 2 hours. And during the time, he was glad that I was asking some of the questions, and others have asked him too, but I was just the new guy on the block. And one of the things he said was he knew what Jay was thinking before he got out of bed in the morning. He just knew him that well. And he said the rumors that were floating around, or the interpretation of what he thought of with the dividend for the people, and remember the militant ring, right, that they would have, which has worked pretty good the last 4 or 5 years, I would argue, to get the people involved, was that was exactly what Governor Hammond intended, and he was going to speak out about it because he said people were misinterpreting what the governor actually intended. He absolutely thought the people should get a share, and it was always a part of that common ownership, because I've also heard the socialism and other comments about this, about it, and I go, actually, when you really think about it, what we're doing is capitalism. We're taking money, we're investing it in the stock market, and we have dividends and we're handing them out. Welfare, to me, an entitlement program, is you're taking tax money from somebody else and then you're just giving it to somebody else. This is entirely different to me. I don't see that argument. I think it falls flat. So I wanted to throw that out there because we've had this discussion. I want to bring up one other thing because it's also important, and you mentioned it. You had it towards the end, and we've had this discussion too. And that is that people have to understand, if we go down this path and we put it in the Constitution and it's there, it will by necessity drive other things that we will have to consider, the consequences of our actions. Some of that being, if we have a certain amount we're going to pay for the dividend, then, and we have a certain level of government services, whether we choose to reduce the cost of government or have to create more taxes, we have to balance the books somewhere in here. So we've had that discussion. We're not afraid of it, right? We said we're going to put all options on the table, which could include taxes of some sort. It may include changes to the oil tax structure. All kinds of other things will be driven by that. But that's our purview. That's what we do. We should have those discussions. But one of the things I'm concerned about, and Senator Costello highlighted this, as did you, is that it seems like the people come last. And I think that's something that we need to consider in this argument is, at what cost do we do that when certain groups are being excluded from funding government and having the services, but which ones are taking the biggest hit? And I think it's crystal clear in the data that especially the poorest, the worst off Alaskans get hit the most by a percentage when the dividend is taken from them compared to other groups. And it's things that I think this is just needs to be on the table for the discussion as we go through it, because it is a big part of it. And yes, I'm in the podium and I got it for a moment, so I'm using the microphone, but these are things we have to consider throughout it to find that balanced approach. So, Senator Holland, do you have a question? Okay, I just wanted to get that out there before we get to the next part. Were there any other questions or comments? And anything else you want to add, Senator Wilkowski, at the moment? No. Okay, then I think next we're going to go to Sonia for a sectional analysis. Right.
Good afternoon, Chair Schauer and the members of the committee. My name is Sonia Kawasaki. I'm Chief of Staff to Senator Bill Wilkowski. Senate Joint Resolution, Sectional Analysis, Section 1, Elimination of the Permanent Fund Earnings Account. Under Article 9, Section 15 of the Alaska Constitution, the Permanent Fund is comprised of a principal that may not be accessed for government spending. The income from investments of the principal may be provided for by law. Currently, all earnings of the fund are deposited in the earnings reserve account as established by law. SJR 1, Section 1 would foreclose the possibility of an earnings holding account, and any future earnings would be retained as non-spendable principal. Section 2, establishment of the POMV and PFD payment formula in the Constitution. This section provides for a constitutionalized percent of market value POMV draw from the permanent fund that is set at 5% and is based on an average value of the fund over 5 fiscal years. Section 2 then establishes that payments of dividends to Alaskans will either be by the calculation set by the historic statutory formula as constitutionalized, or 50% of the POMV, whichever would produce a dividend of greater value. Section 3, providing for transition provisions, Article 15 of the Alaska Constitution would be amended to provide for transition, implementation, and timing necessary to affect the material provisions of SJR 1 upon approval of the voters. The balance of the earnings reserve account would be deposited into the corpus of the fund at the end of fiscal year 2023, and the material provisions of SJR 1 would become effective for state budgeting purposes during fiscal year 2024. Section 4, placement of the proposal before the voters. Pursuant to Article 13, Section 1, amendments to the Alaska Constitution must be presented to the voters for approval, which is only permissible during a state general election. Under SJR 1, Section 4, the proposal would therefore be placed before the voters on November 8, 2022.
Okay. Questions? Just wanted to catch up there. Writing notes to myself. Questions from the committee or comments for the sectional analysis? Okay. I'm going to circle back for a second then, back to the bill sponsor. It's a little bit different because you're here, so we can talk about it and ask questions. And these some of the same questions that we have bounced around the reducing the cost of government, taxation, etc., as we balance the books with these programs would be, and we're asked of the administration, but the governor's not here to ask, and they'll typically come before committee. So a little tougher, which is why I'm asking you, but to be frank for the public, as we're looking at this, those same questions would be asked of them, but when you get to the commissioners and others, they're reticent to ask them because they don't want to, answer policy questions. I would, if you wouldn't mind, could you comment, because we had this debate as well, again, kind of just catching everybody back up from 2 years ago, when the language was changed from DGF to UGF, I believe it was in 2017, I may have that wrong, and it's something Senator Costello mentioned as well, and you might have, where this used to be, in essence, what we would, in the military would have called pass-through funds, where we just did it, and off it went, and we didn't touch it, and then that changed, and the language changed, and that was pointed out, I believe, in finance. I want to say when I was first, for the year I was on it, would you mind commenting to that, how that happened, that changed, because I believe you were on finance as that took place.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I understand your question correctly, the way the statute is currently written, the permanent fund is obligated to the permanent fund corporation is obligated to transfer funds that are in the permanent fund to the Department of Revenue, and then they're supposed to calculate the formula, calculate how much is to be paid out under the dividend formula, and then they automatically transfer. Our position has always been that automatic transfer. That was quite frankly the position of Senator Clemtillion, former Senate President, in 1976 when the Constitutional Amendment was created, and Senate President Rick Halford, who was the Senate President when the dividend was created. It was an automatic transfer. In fact, in the first several years of the dividend program, it was automatically transferred. There was no legislative appropriation, automatically transferred. At some point, that changed. And I think it changed actually much earlier. The automatic transfer changed after several years. And at some point, the legislatures began to appropriate it. And do you remember when that happened, Sonia?
The very first year, it transferred automatically, and then in the first year of Governor Sheffield's, when he became governor, I think they started putting it into the appropriation bill because to weaken it.
So it has been appropriated by the legislature for many years, Mr. Chairman.
That's a good clarification. The reason I ask is because we had a discussion in 2019 in Finance and Senate, and it talked about, and the former Ledge Finance Director was briefing this, and he talked about it, and we pulled up in it, and we caught a note of that it said up until 2017, or maybe starting in 2017, it went from DGF to UGF as far as how they put it in. We have some dedicated funds, but we're prohibited. We have designated funds, so I allude that from my brain to a pass-through fund. It's designated, it's got a purpose, off it goes, we don't really touch it, we may appropriate it, but we don't mess with it. And it seemed like that was kind of when the language changed. Of course, that was the year after what happened with Governor Walker, and it seemed like it was almost top cover, if that makes sense, for the ability for us to kind of do what we wanted with it. And that's about the time we did that.
You are correct, there was a change, and we can actually get you the details. We had researched that pretty thoroughly, and I can get you the details and provide that for the committee, Mr. Chairman.
I'm not sure. I don't think we really need to. I just want to, again, part of this is public record as we're getting back into the debate of these bills, that we did change things to make it easier for us to do what we're doing right now, which is to just set any number every year, whatever we want, as Senator Costello pointed out, where this has become it's almost like a game of chance. What's it going to be this year? I have no idea. There's no assurance of it, and it just seems to continue to shrink. And I wanted one more point. You're certainly welcome to talk to this if you would like to. But I hear a lot of discussion as well around this of value of services. because we're trying to now, some of the explanations say, well, if we take the PFD, it's because we're given a certain amount of government services. There's a lot of things to discuss here. Just in the interest of time, I wanted to comment on it, and see if you had any thoughts as well, because that is certainly true. We can equate there is a certain amount of government services, certain segments of the population use them. I've heard things like, well, the ferry system or roads or schools or whatever. However, that is not equal. Some people don't have a car. Some people don't have kids in school. They still pay property taxes, which eats up a lot of the funding. So you can say that if you apply for a PFD, it's equally distributed. Doesn't matter if you're a billionaire or millionaire or you're the poorest person in the state. You can equally distribute that. That's basically how we do that. However, the value of services to people can be quite different. And so while some people are trying to equate the value of a PFD and taking it to give you a certain amount of government services, that is not apples to apples comparison. That is an apples to oranges comparison. And so I'm trying to throw that, I'm trying to stay away from that argument so that we understand that the value of this is very different, like the ICER research you pointed out, and the value to somebody that has less income as a percentage goes up much greater. And you could take a family of four, which I spoke about last year on the floor, when we talked about the value of a full statutory dividend in a pandemic when people were losing their jobs. And I used my daughter's family as an example. $1,000 that we gave out, $992, doesn't go too far for a family of four. But when it's $4,000, but when it's $12,000 plus federal, then it was $15,500. Well, that starts to really add up. So it does have an unequal impact for different people, and I just wanted to bring that out as well as the argument as we get back to the discussion, because as you pointed out, it is of great benefit to many Alaskans, especially the least well-off amongst us, and it is a bump to our economy, how many times it circulates through a private dollar, et cetera, et cetera. So if you don't have to comment, but I thought it was something that should be brought up.
It's a great point, and I think this is where maybe there's a little confusion, or maybe people have different interpretations of why we have a dividend. And I can only speak on what I've read and what I've listened to in the committee hearings going back 1976, going back 1982, and 1980 when the dividend program was created. And what they said at the time, and what I believe to be true today, is when the permanent fund was created, there was no universal agreement on what to do with those funds. You've all heard the story. We got $900 million from the lease of Prudhoe Bay. It was at a time when we had an annual budget of $170 million, and within 5 or 6 years, the money was spent. And that's the equivalent of getting probably $40 or $50 billion today and spending it all. And there was a lot of frustration by the people of Alaska, of all political persuasions, a lot of anger that money, and I think a lot of it, or some of it at least, was used for infrastructure and used for things that we still benefit from today. But the reality is people were not happy with that. And that's why the permanent fund was created, because they wanted to take that money and save it for future generations. The debate over what to do with the earnings from that immediately began. I mean, even in 1976, there was still the debate. And as we mentioned, you go back, you can listen to the minutes. You will hear very clearly a very clear theme that of discussion of the dividend. They wanted a program where the people could get some of it. And if you go back and listen to the minutes from 1980, 81, 82, when the dividend was being debated, the consensus gradually developed that exactly as you said, Mr. Chairman. Number one, we're going to tie this to our resource wealth, and you see this in countries all over the world, where there is a lot of countries that are resource wealthy. You see a tremendous amount of wealth come in, and the people don't benefit from it. And there's a lot of discussion about this in the 70s and early 80s. They call it the resource curse. And what would happen is the incredible wealth would flow up to the elites, the aristocrats in society, and the average person would see very little of that. And the people who were politically connected, the people who had friends in high places, the people who made contributions to political campaigns, they got an inordinate amount of resource wealth. All the royalties, all the severance taxes went into government, and boy, if you had connections to somebody in a politically powerful place, you got all of a sudden huge amounts of loans and huge amounts of money for projects you were interested in, and that is exactly what they were trying to avoid with the creation of the dividend. They wanted to see every single person in Alaska every man, woman, child get some share. There's certainly a recognition that we have to provide for public services. We've got to provide for education, public safety. But there was absolutely a recognition that the oil collectively belongs to all of us. And how do we ensure that we follow our constitutional obligation to make sure that everybody gets a little bit of that? And that is very clearly why they set up the dividend program. And it was Al Adams, who was the House Finance Committee is named after, who put the letter of intent into the permanent fund dividend bill, which says that the earnings are to be paid out for dividends first. The Alaskans get first call on that. It wasn't to be first call to pay for government services. You know, we can have that debate over how we're going to pay for those other things. We're the only state in the country that has a dividend program now. And every other state in the country has figured out a way to pay for those services without a dividend. We're not saying don't use any permanent fund earnings for government. We're not saying that at all. In fact, we're setting up a POMV structure. We're just trying to ensure that the people continue to get some of it, because otherwise, that the problem that has existed for ever since we've had oil revenue in this state, and every other oil jurisdiction in the world, is those who are politically powerful will come in to this building and they will figure out a way to get an inordinate amount of the funds going to them and their projects. And that has happened everywhere in the world, and that is what we're trying to avoid with this, trying to make sure everyone gets a share of it. And that's why it's so important to my constituents, because many of my constituents don't work in the oil industry. The vast majority don't. They definitely are interested in education. They're definitely interested in public safety. But at the same time, they deserve to get a share of the resource wealth. All of our constituents do, Mr. Chairman. So thank you for asking the question. I think it's an excellent point.
Thank you, Senator Wilkowski. It's something, like I said, you and I have had many long discussions about, and I do not deny when we discuss government services that, you know, people benefit from them, and I'm also not trying to deny that we shouldn't use a portion of their earnings. We can debate that all day long. It's absolutely true that, you know, some of this wealth flows into those government services that many, if not most of us, use at one time or another, some more often than others. I'm not trying to say that's wrong. Only that as we look at this, how do we fairly balance the books? Because what I've seen so far for the last few years is we're balancing the books on the back of the least well-off Alaskans by taking the dividend. And I think that is not a direction that we want to go, and I don't think that's the most appropriate way for us to handle this. And if we're going to have the discussion, then as I've said before, and I'll kind of end with this, everything needs to be on the table. That means all of it. That means taxes, that means oil tax structure, that means reductions to cost, the spending cap change for the future. Like I said, you and I have discussed this. This is one part of that solution, but it's one that we have to have. So thanks for taking the time. I know that was a little bit more of a debate, but I wanted to get this back out into the public discussion, the discourse. Comments and questions further from the committee for the bill sponsor.
Quick question.
Senator Holland.
Is there a reason why you left the PMV 5% and the statutory historic formula in there? I know people have criticized the historic formula because it produces the supersized PFDs that with our current spending. But is there a scenario that the 5% PMV would actually produce a PFD larger than the historic formula?
Thank you, Senator, through the chair. It's a good question, and it's actually something that we discussed quite a bit. And I have to give Sonia credit. I think it's an elegant solution to the problem. If you just take the permanent fund statute as it exists and you put it into the Constitution, it's an awkward fit, and it's an awkward fit because the dividend relies on the earnings reserve. We will no longer have an earnings reserve under this, and I think that's actually a good thing, because I think the earnings reserve leaves, right now you've got $14 billion in the earnings reserve. If the legislature decided we want to spend $14 billion this year, you could do it, and you only need a 50+1% vote to do that. This eliminates that ability. So in some ways it acts as a spending cap, but we just felt like this, if you're going to eliminate the earnings reserve, you needed some sort of way that you could provide funding, a funding mechanism for government and a funding mechanism for the people to get their dividend. This seemed to be the best way to do it. We set it at 5%, which seems to be a commonly held number. The projections by Callan are, I believe, around 6.5% to 7%, so that leaves you a 1.5% to 2% automatic inflation proofing. There are scenarios going into the future. This is one thing I've heard. One concern we were trying to address by doing this was, well, if you set up a POMV structure, there could be years where you get a less of a dividend, and that is true. We wanted to try to avoid that scenario, and so they're in market downturns and years perhaps where oil revenue is extremely low. There could very well be situations. In fact, I think back in 2010, probably every around 8 or 9 or 10 years, we've run into a situation where we've barely had enough to pay for a dividend, and so we were trying to address all those little issues, and I think this way did it. This way captured it. It was just trying to solve that dilemma of what happens when you get rid of the earnings reserve and how do you continue on with our structure. You want to add something?
Thank you.
Good. Other comments and questions from the committee? I just have one last comment. Perhaps if we just invest it all in Bitcoin in a year or so, we'll all be good to go and never have to worry about money in the state again, if that's any indication of where it's headed. Okay. I'd like to thank everybody for their presentations. Gabe, if you guys want to just sit there for a second, we're going to just bow out for now. For the record, our next State Affairs Committee meeting, we will set this bill aside, by the way. For the record, next State Affairs Committee meeting will be this Thursday, February 11th at 3:30, and we will hear invited testimony on SB 39 election integrity. Seeing no further business before the committee at this time, we will now adjourn at 4:59. Thanks.
Hey. Sorry about that. Got to just adjust the tripod there. Interesting meeting that they had there. SB 53 SJ6. Got to listen to both of the legalese on those bills. And I guarantee you I would be voting no for both of them. It puts full control of both the ERA and the corpus of our account into the hands of the legislator. They may pay us a dividend if they want. They can change the formula. They can do whatever they want on what we are to get in the future. And us Alaskans aren't going to have much choice on it. It caps the PFD. We'll never see a bigger one. We'll be beyond what it is set. So on and so forth. It's just bad news, both of the bills that were presented there. Then Bill Wilikowski came out and he has his SJR1. This is a bill that's been around for the last couple of years also. And but out of all the ones that are presented, this is the one that I would get behind. It enshrines our statutory PFD formula into the Constitution. It is non-negotiable. There is no way our legislators could ever come back and try to change it again. The only part I don't like about it, but hey, you know, you got to compromise sometimes. You got to be realistic here. Our state is going to be losing money in the future as we go, as they say, green and start moving away from our main money producer, which is oil. And we got to be able to have some way to be able to fund our government, so there still would be a 5% POMV draw for our government to use to spend. But that's it. And if there is ever to be any change ever done to it in the future, it has to go to the vote of the people before they could ever change that from happening. So they just can't do like they have been doing, ignoring the statutory law and completely doing whatever the hell they want, putting up these fictitious caps, saying, oh, we got to spend only this for the budget, and we only can give you this much for your PFDs. And because it's under that make-believe $6 billion cap, after we got done spending our $5.4 billion, there's only $600 million left. Here's your $1,000 PFD. And that's basically how they have been running things now for the last couple of years. Also using tax revenue to pay our permanent fund dividends, you know, the oil revenue and all that they get for taxes, not what's in our ERA, to pay our permanent fund dividend. First year they used only a portion of tax revenue to do that. Last year I believe they used the entire tax revenue to pay out our permanent fund dividend, and then the money that they transferred from the ERA over into the UGF account basically was theirs to spend on government. It didn't get used to spend on our permanent fund dividends. You got to look at how the budget was written, and the way it was written, our PFD was paid using tax revenue. If the oligarchy that has been in control of the House and the Senate stays in full control, we would be seeing no PFD here in the future. Fortunately, so far, the Senate seems to be doing extremely well until you get to the Budget Finance Committee, which happens to be held by the same people. We got Bert Stedman, we got David Wilson, we've got Natasha von Imhoff in there. Thank God she's not the chair this year. But you get the idea. It's the same people that were in the Budget Committee, Finance Department, part of the committees that were in it last year and the year before. So I'm not expecting to see much change when it comes to trying to cut that budget. They're going to do everything in their power to keep that budget jacked up. That's who those people really are. But as it goes for the bills moving forward here today, SJR 1, the one that by Bill Wielechowski, his is the only one that I can get behind. The one part that I'm not too sure if I like, if I caught it correctly, is the ERA would be eliminated under this new formula. There is inflation proofing that goes on, but there'll be no ERA and no corpus. It'll all be one, but it will be stuck under a fixed formula. So it literally becomes a PFD that is permanent, and it's under the statutory formula, and the only way that can be changed would be by the vote of the people, us Alaskans. Kind of the way it should have been since day one, but hopefully we'll get better clarification as they have more meetings on this. Tentatively, it looks like it's going to be sometime next week before they get back on this bill. I'll keep track as soon as I get word on when it's going to be, and I'll be sure to live stream it. Don't forget to like and share. Facebook squeals on you if you don't. If you live in Anchorage and you're in the municipality of Anchorage, they have their assembly meeting that is starting right about now. I believe right about now. And tonight they've got a lot of things that are on the discussions to be happening that affects all people that live in the MOA. New ordinances that they want to pass, more money that they want to spend, and trying to get rid of Assemblywoman Jamie Allard. The racist far left socialist assembly that runs Anchorage is trying to get rid of the only sane voice that happens to be there, just because she wanted to start an open discussion about words that were used. How do you know it's not someone's name? It very well could have been. You just don't know. If you look it up, we have a few of them here in Alaska. I'm not going to say the words out loud because I don't want Facebook to ban me. Sorry about that. Just a pet peeve when it comes to the stupid, silly little things. Free discussion, free speech goes out the window. You can't even have a discussion to debate anything. You've already lost. They censor you. They shut you down. They make sure you can't have a voice in what's coming up. So SJR 1 out of the 3 bills heard today. I got to rechange what I had written on the top of the post there. I was assuming a couple of different bills was going to be heard today. I wasn't aware SJR 1 was one of them. So I just got to do a quick switch on that. And other than that, don't forget, again, like, share this video. Alaskans need to hear what's going on with these constitutional amendments. Make sure you put on there that SJR 1 seems to be the only one that has any reasonable mentality behind the bill itself. The other 2 just basically hands the money over to the legislators for our permanent fund dividends, and they can do whatever they want with it. And us Alaskans aren't going to have a voice in the matter. If they do that, they can do whatever they want through legislation without the need of Alaskans' voices being involved. SJR 1, though, on the other hand, allows Alaskans to have their voice and permanently enshrines the statutory formula into the Constitution of Alaska. So it can't be changed by legislation alone. And let me see. Go to my website, Politadick.com, and click that support button. I want to be able to make sure that I'm here to live stream these things for you, but if it comes between me and being able to make a buck, I am going to go to work. And I am going to go do what I get paid to do for a living, and so that I can actually make a living and put food on my table. It's a necessity of life, as you all know. You know that 4-letter word, work. And but if every donation that comes in, it means that's one more time that I don't have to go out and earn a living, and I can be here earning a living and being able to make sure keeping Alaskans informed on what is most important to Alaskans that we need to know. You all have yourself a great afternoon. If you're in Anchorage, go to the MOA is having a meeting at the Lusac Library. Very controversial issues going on tonight. Jamie Allard being censored and possibility of them trying to kick her completely out of the assembly. But at least we'll put it simply, they want to censor her and make sure that your voices and your votes, that the folks that voted for her to be in that assembly, are going to be silenced. And that just can't be happening. People need to have every right to be able to speak their mind, have their opinions, and have an open discussion, and not be calling a racist or Nazi because your opinions don't match the far left agenda and what they want to have you believe as to be what is most important. All right, you guys all have a great afternoon. I'm out.